challenging topic for resources industry. Obviously, KPMG has a very broad remit, but we do work with the resources industry as well as work with ESG and how that applies to many of our complex challenges in resources. So we were delighted when Jen reached out to us to be able to help her commission this report. The report, as Jen mentioned, has on the website has one main long version and then has two components to it as well, part 1 and part 2. The first part is about defining and implementing, and the second part is about measuring and reporting, all topics that are, quite challenging at the moment for due to the uncertainty about what's the right way to do it, what's the Australian way to do it, what's the international and global way to do it, and how is that way of doing it changing over time. The environment is obviously very dynamic and there's a lot of change coming, but what's about right and how can the Australian gas industry respond to those different elements? So we are hoping through the work that AGIT's commissioned that they can provide some guidance to the industry more broadly on some of those topics. But it's a conversation that I think in resources we certainly need to have. I'm joined by a team, Eamon Standring, who helped us with the report, currently from PlotLogic, and Sally and Maddie from KPMG, who also did a lot of the research, a lot of whiteboarding. We had a lot of complex diagrams that had question marks about how does the Australian gas industry grapple with some of these things. But we like to throw ourselves at complex problems, and this is the one for the generation. I think our children and grandchildren will hold us to account on some of these things. And the complex areas are in resources, and I work across mining industry as well. And I, in the mining case, I certainly see mining as part of the solution, not the problem to our key energy transition challenges. So I might, from here, briefly hand over to Eamon to talk about how we designed and approached the support to AGIT to develop this report, and how it was then divided. And Sally and Maddie are going to talk through each of the parts respectively. Part 1, defining and implementing, and part 2, measuring and reporting. Jen, I'm assuming that everyone has a copy of the report or has access to the websites. We can share the screen to show people if
Absolutely.
you like. But, yeah,
absolutely.
Okay, understood. So I guess, Eamon, it might be worth you probably just briefly talking about our journey working with Jen and AGIT to develop the report, and then how we sort of worked with the AGIT team to sort of test our ideas, develop concepts. What was the frameworks we were going to use? How did we come up with a 12 pillars model? And then sort of divide the report into part 1 and 2, where Sally and Maddie can talk about it in more detail.
Yeah, awesome. Absolutely. Hi all, my name is Eamon Standring. I'm an accounts manager here at PlotLogic, which is a hyperspectral company in mining, but very recently I was working as part of Matt's team, KPMG, helping to pull together this pretty exciting report. So basically, yeah, the report kind of works off a few premises. So we kind of started out by considering, well, one, it's a very large question. What is ESG? So what, for instance, comes under the headings of it? What are the E, the S, and the G? I mean, obviously, there's a lot of focus within the industry and every industry on your carbon emissions and your kind of environmental management. But how do we dive deeper into our social and governance factors that are becoming more and more important by the day? So largely our approach to this report came by working with a number of different stakeholders. So at KPMG, we had internal stakeholders who do a lot of work in ESG and are experts in oil and gas and those kind of things. And we worked very closely with Jen's team at AGIT, doing a number of interviews and working sessions and groups, etc., just brainstorming, throwing ideas, tearing apart the things that we'd come up with, and then putting them back together a little bit stronger than they were. So the report, broadly speaking, covers a few different headings. So we kind of start off by looking what is the question of ESG. So I mean, it's derived partly from these ideas of like corporate social responsibility that kind of developed into the UN Charter for Human Rights, and it kind of flows through in that sort of respect. So essentially in the report, we talk about kind of what is the current role of gas. Now, as members of the gas industry, I'm sure you're aware, it underpins a huge number of important things within our society, such as agriculture and, the production of, polymers for rubber products and those kind of things. And obviously, most importantly, as an energy source, both for export and domestic use. Which is, has some benefits regarding and in comparison to other fuel sources. But basically, we went on from there and we kind of talked about, so what are the trends that are shaping the industry? You know, like we have IEA scenarios that kind of talk about the energy transition and where the role of gas kind of fits into the future. So we kind of rested on the fact that there is quite a significant role for gas moving into the future based on the stated policy scenario and those kind of things. We then kind of talked about the other side of the equation, which is what are the trends that are actually driving ESG? So, you know, once again, corporate social responsibility, you know, a social license to operate, requirements to reduce your emissions in the face of climate change, those kind of things. And so on the balance of those two, we kind of presented the two different I suppose, faces of the problem, if you will. One, that there's an important role for gas to play in the future, and two, that there probably needs to be some changes to our energy mix that perhaps sometimes contrast and in sometimes challenge the predominant narratives within that. So from there, we kind of went on and we looked at, all right, well, outside of environment, which is probably the most material issue in ESG, what else is kind of shaping it? And so we looked at the social and governance factors, some of the emerging trends. And if you look into that report, I'm sure you can enjoy. We've got a bunch of really lovely little pages there looking at each little heading under ESG. So just to give you a few of the main points and challenges and things that you should be doing as organizations to consider them. From there, we kind of jumped into you know, the role of the gas industry and what it looks like in the supply chain, just keeping in mind that a response to ESG is really building sustainability in your business, and it's about having a positive impact and making meaningful change. And so within that, you know, a lot of people take it as a challenge, but really a lot of the time it's an opportunity. You can think about your impact, and each organization is going to have a substantially different response to ESG depending on where they operate in the value chain, what their size is, you know, what their remit is. So there's all of these different considerations. And so flowing down from there, we talked about some of the reporting and metrics standards. So, you know, how is reporting actually measured? There's a huge explosion of different reporting and standardization organizations that people can align to and talk about. And it's not immediately clear if you're a new player in the industry, or perhaps if you're a smaller player, how can I align to these? Or, you know, which ones should I align to? And these guys rate me at a 10 and these guys rate me at a 3. What's the real answer here? So we kind of talk about that and how it's important to bring out your own reporting and build into your own ESG strategy kind of that alignment that's important. And from there, we kind of just gave a few frameworks for you know, how do you actually align. We had the DART framework, so, you know, define your ambition. I'll let you read the rest of them there. But then coming on forward, we had you know, just a little bit of an overview of some further reading and things like that, just giving a bit of a summary of the messages for the gas industry. So overall, as a piece, what we were trying to do is hit the nail on the head for really what's driving ESG, and largely it is that kind of social and business and regulatory pressure that there will be changes in the future driven by, you know, climate change and these kind of things. But that there are huge opportunities in that, and that there are a number of ways that you can harness what looks like a challenge to be an opportunity. And then, you know, how do you actually go about that and how to break it down? So look, I've rambled for enough now, team. So I'm happy to hand over, but hopefully that gives you a bit of an overview of kind of how we approached it. And I guess just one further thing, just in terms of the interviews, etc. I think one of the most exciting and challenging things here was bringing together all of the different disparate views that there are, because it's going to be a very contentious topic. I mean, especially, you know, like we've definitely had some clients where we chat to them and, you know, you say the word ESG and they physically recoil slightly. So it was a real pleasure to bring together those different views and kind of, I think, arrive on quite a balanced kind of factual view of what the future looks like without giving a narrative, but just giving the two sides of the equation so that people can understand what the contentious forces are that are driving change, and then to plot a path through it somewhere in the middle ground. So awesome. Thanks so much, guys.
Thanks, Eamon. Before we roll into probably a bit of a more detailed look at part 1, part 2, and I think we can probably put these documents up so you can have a quick look through. I just wanted to sort of highlight some of that. I think it would be very rare to find an organisation that's completely aligned on their thoughts with ESG, because it just covers so many different things. And the immediate thing with ESG is you think, oh, it's about emissions and with the energy transition, and it's not. It's much broader than that. And so I think what we realized as we were sort of delving into all the different components of ESG was that we're sort of, as a society, we've got multiple transformations happening at once. We've got a transformation obviously happening in energy and how we emit carbon and other gases as part of that energy transition. But I think we've got a social transition as well, how we engage communities, how much buy-in social communities have into what big organisations and small organisations do, and the level of custodianship that we need to engage those communities on. And as well as that, I think there's probably a lot more information and misinformation that the community has about what organisations that work in some of these resources industry does. So I think part of this reporting is to try and close the gap between perception and reality on what's actually going on out there. There's a lot of rhetoric that's on social media, there's a lot of rhetoric that's in the news and in politics, but how do we as a resources industry make sure that we educate the community on the facts and get close to the data on what's real and what's achievable, and make sure that we can set a pathway that's realistic and makes sense. And I think that's what what getting the solution right is all about. So part of that, our role we see is education. Part of that, our role is to help with reports like this to help educate people on those factors. So lots of different complexity. But we might then roll into the two parts of the actual report. So Sally, did you want to quickly share the part one and have a quick chat about that?
Yeah, for sure, Matt. I'll share my screen. Just a moment. Alrighty. Let me know if that's good to go.
You're good to go.
Perfect. So hi everyone, I'm Sally Bowden, a consultant in the Engineering Assets and Project Delivery team at KPMG. I did a double degree in Chemical Engineering and Business at QUT. And yeah, I agree with everything that's been said so far. This was a really fascinating report to put together, and the discussion that went into it was very thorough. So I think it's a really great product to put out to the industry. So I'll be taking you through part one of this report, the defining and implementing of ESG. So this section of the report was more of a overview for those who haven't heard of ESG before, who have it already implemented within their business structure, and is more of a descriptive and I guess providing clarity on what is ESG for a wider audience. So obviously the introduction here has the purpose of the practice guide and what is ESG, so explaining that the environmental, social and governance factors and that these can positively develop an organization's performance in the market, social impact and their governance practices. So as we move through here, we have a brief overview of the risks and opportunities. So obviously there are significant risks if ESG is not not added within your business and not included. So things such as reputational risk and social license, loss of talent and skills, reduced access to capital, and legal challenges and disruptions. So as ESG does become more prominent within the industry, it is important to recognize the risks of not incorporating it into your business. And then on the other hand here, we do have the opportunity. So with ESG, you have the potential to grow your customer attraction and also increase your capital and finance capabilities. In addition to that, the addition of talent in creating a more supportive workplace and increased outreach and impact in communities. So that's just a high level of the risks and opportunities that we thought were most relevant to include here. So the next section of this report, this here is an overview of what the rest of this part one is about. So it's explaining the three key pillars and the categories within each of them. And so we thought this diagram was adept at showing visually in a really simple manner what goes into each of the ESG coverage little sections. So as we move through the report, they'll be grouped together in this order. So the environmental section of this report, so obviously the environmental aspect of ESG is one of the most prevalent that people are aware of and that people are implementing so far. So within the environmental section, we included consumption and waste, climate emissions, land and biodiversity, and water stewardship. So we, after thorough discussion, we ended up that these were the most key things that fit into the environmental section for the Australian gas industry. So moving on So the report is structured so that we have the main key pillar, and then each of these subsections will have their own page. So I won't run through all of them, considering the time we have today, but just a general overview, we have just a brief description of what the section's about and the key considerations that were taken into account for each of these subsections. And then in addition to this, we also included a case study. So we thought this would be really beneficial for both large, medium and small cap organizations to see how to see an exceptional example of ESG being implemented in companies already. So there was a lot of stakeholder interview and investigation that went into selecting which case study would be suitable for each subsection. And so the ones we have picked, a few of them are APIA award winners, and they all boast a really positive ESG impact from their company. So just providing really good examples there for the industry to look to and potentially implement similar items within their own companies. So as we move through consumption and waste, this was our these were all within the environmental pillar, land and biodiversity and water stewardship. And again, we've got a little, we just noted, if one was an award winner for Project of Excellence, just so people know. So moving on to social, the next one of the three big pillars. So social ESG considers how a business operates and impacts with the wider community and also impacts with all their stakeholders. So this is a very important aspect of ESG as it includes and focuses on a business's support and investment to better communities around them in which they operate. So the four key elements we looked at here was community alliance, responsible production, stakeholder collaboration, and people and diversity. So moving into community alliance, this is quite vital to maintaining a social license to operate, just ensuring you have collaboration and cooperation with the communities in which you work with. And again, here you can see we have our key considerations for community alliance and 2 case studies for this one because we thought this was fairly important. And in addition to this, community alliance also includes Indigenous partnerships, which is fairly significant within the Australian gas industry and a lot of the operating sites. So moving on, we have stakeholder collaboration. Again, there are those key considerations and the case study, again, focusing on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander relationships. We have responsible production, and then moving on, we also have people and diversity. So I'll move into the governance section. So this is the last of the 3 pillars, and governance is a fairly strong foundation of ESG. So as governance is continually changing and evolving, it is always important to have the correct governance structure to ensure your business has transparency, compliance, and reliability in reporting and disclosures. So within governance, we looked at risk management, ethical practices, reporting and standards, and accountability. So we thought these were fairly prevalent to ensure we captured these within the governance section. So reporting and standards, this is what the second report, which Maddie will take you through, goes into detail about the ESG metrics and standards. So I won't run through that one. But again, the case study for this, it was more so around just how ESG reporting is conducted. But yeah, I'll leave Maddie to go further into that one. So we looked at ethical practices, which is obviously the inclusive behaviour, proactive health and safety considerations, and transparent business practices. So really important when operating within the Australian gas industry, just the human rights, health and safety, business ethics, and best practice. So moving on, again, accountability, really vital for companies to have strong accountability and a framework for holding itself and people accountable for ESG. So this is making sure that if ESG is implemented, the targets and metrics that you use within your company, that you're accountable for them. Again, the key considerations and the case study here on transparency and communication. And the last one for governance was risk management. So as I'm sure you're already aware, risk management is vital to any company. So we made sure to include it as it is a vital part of ESG as well. So yes, that brings us to the end of the 3 main pillars. And as you can see, we went into quite a bit of detail surrounding what the sub-elements surrounded, the key considerations, and then the case study there. And so this one closes out with the framework. I think Eamon mentioned it earlier. We came up with a little acronym DART framework. So this just is here to provide an overview of, if you don't already have ESG practices or guides within your organization, just provides a few stepping stones to I guess, yeah, push you on your way and help you implement it within your company. So very high level. In the full report, there is a more detailed framework if you'd like to look in that. And then a summary here. This is also at the conclusion of Maddie's report. So I might leave this one for her to just conclude the session, as it is, included in the second report as well. But yeah, so that's just a little overview of the part 1 of the practice guide. I might pass over to Maddie now.
And
Awesome.
before Maddie starts, I was going to say this summary of ESG messages, I think, got the most whiteboard time. I think it sat on whiteboards and was re-scrubbed out and more consultation, work with agent, and so I guess we bounced around a lot what the key messages were. But I think one of the points with this, especially this forum and this audience, is what do you think the key messages, ESG messages are? And once you get a chance to have a look at these, we'd be really interested in your commentary on what are the key messages and what have we left out, and what are your views on these messages? Thanks, Maddie.
Thanks, Eamon, Sally, and Matt. So just a quick introduction. My name's Maddie McGann. I'm a senior con here with the Climate and Energy Transition team at KPMG. My background is in environmental law and science, and before working with KPMG, I had experience working with resource companies and governments as a planning environment lawyer here in Brisbane. So yeah, it's my pleasure to take you now through part 2, measuring and reporting. A little more boring than Sally's part, but please bear with me and I'll keep it nice and brief. Here we go. So let's take you through page by page. I won't cover off on the 12 pillars. Sally's done a great job of that. But really getting down into the reporting and measuring aspect of ESG. So you can be doing a great job, but if nobody knows about it and you're not meeting your compliance obligations and reporting requirements to regulators, then that's an issue. So why report? Well, ESG reporting provides organisations with an opportunity to demonstrate commitment, but it also is part of, in some cases, in some states, a fragmented sort of compliance and regulatory environment. But through accurate and transparent ESG reporting, investors, financiers, and communities are provided with information that helps them to understand what the company is doing, and also ensures that companies are better prepared to manage risks and seize opportunities around ESG issues. So disclosure requirements on ESG issues have grown significantly in recent years, and the key drivers for that here are stakeholder expectations, regulatory developments, and access to capital, as well as ensuring compliance with insurance needs. So broad ESG reporting in Australia remains voluntary, but as many of you would know, there are mandatory legislative requirements for components of ESG in those buckets that Sally just described, where businesses do need to be responding to government on particular issues. we have received guidance from regulators in recent years, including ASIC and APRA, who are starting to provide a little bit more guidance around considerations of ESG and sustainability more broadly. But for the most part here in Australia, it still remains a state by state, even local government by local government in some instances, requirement to be reporting on your environmental, social and governance performance. So just quickly going down here. Now, what we really wanted to explain and bear out in this report is that ESG reporting is not standardized. It's not standardized globally. It's not standardized domestically at this point. There are a number of key initiatives, some that you may have heard of and some that you may not have, that have been driving and quite influential in recent years around bringing ESG to the fore in conversations and leading a push for global demand and ESG metrics. So this standardization of regulatory guidelines, metrics and standards will ensure higher quality of accurate reporting within an industry. But at this stage, we are seeing industries either advocate for or voluntarily adopt reporting standards, or sort of just like go it alone in building their own corporate ESG reporting framework that they think meets their needs, both in terms of compliance but also in terms of communicating publicly their ESG performance. It's got two international examples here. The first is the International Sustainability Standards Board. Now, this is a very recent formation that happened at the UN Climate Change Conference last year. It was announced, it aims to provide a comprehensive global baseline for ESG-related disclosure, provide standards to investors and market participants on information around company sustainability and related risks and opportunities. And we also have the Global Reporting Initiative, which is much older. It was created in 1997, and it's an independent international organisation that aims to provide a common language for business to take responsibility for social, environmental and economic impact. So just popping down more, we've sort of built these out a little bit further in this part of the report. The TCFD might have, the Task Force for Climate Financial Related Disclosure might be one of the recent initiatives that you may have heard of. It was brought about very much driven by the Bank of England, actually, so very much built influenced by financiers, and it sets out a climate risk and reporting framework for companies, and that has been very quickly adopted by a number of industries globally and domestically, and the banks are paying a lot of attention to that reporting framework. So the second part of this page here is to really just show you that there isn't much standardization globally, and even across the UK, Europe, North America, a lot of these sort of places where people play both within the state and across states, ESG is very much still, there's understanding ESG and ESG reporting requirements very much remain part of your governance requirements and responsibilities. And so whether you're a Queensland-based operating across a number of states or operating as a multinational, it will sort of increase the complexity of how you want to report and the function and form of how you report on your ESG. So quickly now popping down, just briefly touched on this, but the Australian regulatory context is also quite fragmented. You will know of a number of sort of core policies that that people need to, around water, the Environmental Biodiversity Conservation Act, the Modern Slavery Act, the Human Rights Act here in Queensland. So a number of pieces of very important legislation that companies are required often to report against, but there is no standardised broad ESG reporting framework in Australia that has been adopted. A quick note on data monitoring and measurement. Your reporting will only be as good as what you put in. So collection of data and its integrity is incredibly important for ESG. not just for the reporting element and communicating that in a meaningful way to your internal and external stakeholders, but also to support data to decision-making processes in your organisation as well, to ensure that you can remain agile and strategic in your ESG decision-making. So you can be audited on publicly available documents. There are a number of sort of ESG agencies globally that might seek to benchmark companies against one another, especially in the sort of resources industry around their ESG claims, ESG performance over years across countries. So that is something that that can happen, and the process here sort of just seeks to give you a very, very high level overview of how that can sort of happen and the scoring systems that have been developed over time. Leaning into that, a company can engage with these independent auditors as well to help them build more robust reporting frameworks for their organisation, to sort of get ahead of that curve. And we'd recommend, if you are looking at these things, to really take a close look at the most recent advice from some of these global agencies and domestic agencies on the sort of key components, but always remembering to sort of keep that fit for purpose for your company and strategically what you have in mind. So just to sort of cap off this segment, overall, it's incredibly beneficial that companies proactively and voluntarily report on ESG. We expect that these reporting requirements and standards will continue to mature over time as social expectation and regulatory compliance also matures. So this will drive strategic conversations across many industries, including resources and gas. And just a final note quickly on greenwashing, which is a term that you may have heard of. So it's a concept that's emerged in recent years to describe misrepresenting the extent to which a strategy or an investment might be environmental, sustainable, or ethical. And we've seen in recent years Australian regulators really start to crack down, and investors as well, on claims that are put in the public sphere around ESG reporting that might not hold up to scrutiny. So while it is incredibly important to report and the integrity of the data information, qualitative and quantitative, that goes into that reporting, it's also important to remember that what you put out in the public sphere can also be scrutinized, and there is increasing attention being paid to greenwashing and how that might influence and impact investors. And if you're interested in that in particular, there was a recent note put out by ASIC in late June 2022 around what that means and how that looks, and how they are considering that in their review of publicly available company information. Yeah, so that's me, and I just quickly wanted to also cap off on this summary of ESG messages for the gas sector. And Eamon, Sally, and Matt, please pop in on this. We've already quickly discussed it, but what we really wanted to do with this report was look at tangibly how ESG specifically, is impacting the gas sector, and also how the gas sector can help to progress a lot of ESG issues as well. So the 6 that we have here were hotly debated, constantly redefined and refined. And as Matt says, if there's feedback or views or any enlightening thoughts on these things, I think the takeaway message here is that there's an opportunity in ESG for everyone, and there's no one size fits all to doing great ESG. So lots of opportunity there. So back to you, Matt. Thanks, everyone.
If I could just jump in there as well, Maddie, I think the best way to summarize these messages here is that, everyone talks about, the 12 different things in ESG, and then, there's so many considerations under each one, and it all becomes very confusing and convoluted. But I think the real message here, once again, coming back to that greenwashing story, is realistically, ESG is an attempt to achieve sustainability and positive impact. And when people talk about the impact of ESG or the impact of the energy transition, what they're really implying there is the impact to your existing ways of working and your existing ways of doing business. And I think the real message behind ESG and the real goal here is for people to build in their minds an idea of what the future looks like and what the role of your organizations in the future looks like. And then realistically, the impact of ESG is just a measure of how much your organization is or isn't compatible with, you know, a certain direction that you may go in. So like an impact of social issues per se is mitigated by having a tangibly, genuinely good, positive social impact. So, you know, as much as it's important to consider measurement and reporting and all these kind of things, I think realistically, when you build into your organizational strategies an element of value to these kind of very important things that are covered under the headings of ESG, I think when you have a positive vision and ambition for your organization, a lot of the ESG kind of falls into place, and then it really does become an exercise of trying to move forward gradually on some of these smaller things and trying to track your positive impact. So it doesn't have to be some like a tick box that you just kind of rudimentarily go through. I think we advise a lot of clients that your ambition is not to make money. Your ambition is to do something with your organization, and making money is a byproduct of having a good strategy and a good ambition. And I think ESG really is a good way to measure the efficacy of that ambition and that strategy. So that's all I would add. Cool.
Thanks, everyone. And I guess the final point before we hand over to questions is this is a very dynamic space and things are evolving quickly, and you know, a snapshot in time in 2022 might be different in 2027 or next decade. So and we hope it's for the better. But this space is moving rapidly, probably one of the fastest moving things that are affecting the resources industry. So we hope this provides some guidance and meets Jen's aspirations when she commissioned this report with AGIT. Jen, I'll probably hand over to you for any comments with the AGIT team before we engage the team for questions.
Thanks, Matt. I was just going to thank you all very much for what you've presented here. It is on the money in terms of what the gas industry needs for direction for where ESG is headed. It's a very complex space. And like you said, Maddie, one size does not fit all. In fact, one size sometimes doesn't even fit one part of the gas industry. The nice thing about where we sit here in Australia and the gas industry itself is that we have the benefit of hindsight from America. So when we see what is happening in the States in terms of ESG and measurement and reporting and implementation, we can actually learn a lot about what's winning and what's not over there. So that sort of Australia always being that little bit of a laggard in this space is actually to our benefit. But the other thing that is to our benefit is that we have some of the biggest gas companies here in Australia. Consequently, we can also look to them for guidance. So the Australian gas industry is actually in quite a strong position in terms of ESG. I think the fact that it hasn't actually landed on anything in terms of standardization of implementation, in terms of standardization of measuring and reporting, is probably the downfall of this entire topic. And until we can land on something in terms of ESG and say, okay, that's what we're going to use as a standard, it's all very scattergun, and this report actually makes it a lot less scattergun. So thanks so much. Can we open it up for questions? Any
Not
questions?
all at once, please.
Any questions from anybody? Andre.
Everyone, well done. Great job. One of the elements that I feel is not yet covered enough is the social aspect when we start looking at past kind of the life cycle of the asset. And the comment here is, if you do a good environmental job, there is a sustainability element embedded in that rehabilitation, and it goes kind of beyond, and should be self-sustaining, and nature should take care of it. When we go about the social, it needs really to be a deliberate effort in terms of finding additional primary economic activities to replace what was missed kind of after that asset is no longer producing. And how is the money going to flow back to that community? Because we have more than, I think, 100. When I was looking at abandoned mines, I ended up finding 100 abandoned towns in Australia, which were the aftermath of activities that don't have the support. And I don't see a lot of the ESG discussions touching on that issue and where the responsibility really lies. Is it with the operator of the asset to help the community to develop the next kind of wave of primary economic activity, or not? Just wanted to put up for you for discussion and understand if you have touched on that in the report.
I can say confidently we definitely touched on that, perhaps not in the greatest level of detail ever, but it was definitely one of the big considerations that we talked about. There's a very important role of gas outside of just its individual use cases once you pull it out of the ground, but in the fact that it underpins so many communities, especially, northern Queensland and some relatively remote areas where, gas production and the gas industry really does underpin people's livelihoods, and really does enable communities to exist and thrive. I think it's a very difficult question because, I mean, if you're talking about a depleting resource or something, there's kind of not much that you can do to hang around forever. But I think there's an important value proposition here in that gas companies, and this goes for any resources company, really considers their lasting contribution and their lasting impact to communities. Are we investing in people? Are we investing back into the community? Are we extracting, or is it a give and take kind of relationship? Because in a lot of respects, when the gas industry comes into a certain region, they provide huge opportunities for upskilling, for financial and social mobility for people where there weren't opportunities before. So I think it's important to focus not necessarily just on can we set up a trust, say, or can we continue to finance communities, which is obviously not necessarily possible forever. I think the discussion there is very much around how can we make sure that while we're here, we're not just extracting gas, paying the minimum, importing people, that we're working to uplift the skills of the communities and making sure. And I think we see that a lot in Australia, actually, which is, I think, a great thing about our gas industry, that people are focused on that issue. There is very much an identified important element of uplifting communities and supporting them. But that's a really good comment.
Andre, sorry, Jen.
Donna?
I was going to say, Andre, the same as very much in thermal coal mining. That's probably one of the first cabs off the rank to be transitioned out over the next decade or two. And thermal coal mines in remote parts of Australia are in the same conundrum. What is the transition for the community that's currently supports those assets, and what does that look like? What can the organisations do to help that transition, or even across the mining industry and even the resources industry as a whole? Because as skills transition and the future mine or the future asset, oil and gas asset, in a decade or two's time, the skills required of the people that are operating that asset will be very different to what they are now, and the amount of people that are actually on the site, in the field, in that regional area, those numbers might be very different as well. So, what do organisations need to do to help those communities transition the skills, transition the support required from the asset in those locations?
Yeah, I think the most productive way to think about that potentially, and just conscious of time here, is possibly to consider the fact that, obviously we think of the oil and gas company and then the community, whereas in reality, I would say that the most productive way to think about it and to approach it to achieve a beneficial outcome for everyone is kind of to start to build your ESG approach to kind of be more so that your company is part of the community, it's part of the fabric of that, and the people who work there are part of the community. And so it's not necessarily like one and the other, it's kind of like it's a combination of both, really. And so when you're working to support communities, it doesn't necessarily be like how do we help them? It's kind of like how does our organization beneficially add to the community, which comes into social license to operate, right? Like, people don't want to allow drilling if they don't see a benefit to their community and those kind of things. So there's a lot of different interconnecting issues.
folks, we've got to keep moving.
Yep.
We've got 2 hands up and we've got 2 questions in the background. So Donna McDowell.
Thanks, Jen. I was just wondering, is there any time frame on this international standards that you can see is coming quickly, Maddie? Because, you know, we report on 4 different standards at the moment. And then if you were saying, you know, if you're going to compare, a client might compare you to the other, when you look at then when you go down to the metrics, they all kind of, they all have a different weighting on different things. And so I just don't know how you can compare each other when it comes to bidding or you know, trying to secure tenders, or what to focus on, you know, what should be important.
Yeah, it's an excellent question, Donna, and I wish there was a really simple, great answer I could give you. Probably I'd suggest that the one to watch, and the one that sort of has, there are companies like GRI that have existed for a long time that do provide that, you know, they've got an MSCI that have particular elements they look at, as you say, and things that that you might come across and go, oh gosh, I need to ask people to give me some data and information, whether it's qualitative or quantitative, to build out that element to meet that reporting requirement. I think what we've seen in recent years is, and what I would suggest, is to keep an eye on the International Sustainability Standards Board progress. They have been sort of working through this year, meeting with experts, and they've got working groups. There hasn't been anything substantive that's been sort of released yet, but sort of broadly, there's a lot of international support from states and the UN around that framework that they're developing. And they'll be leaning on the success of frameworks like the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, which has been incredibly well adopted by many companies and governments, actually, around. And I think the success of the TCFD really is born out of the fact that it could piggyback off the back of existing financial disclosure requirements. It doesn't always work for governments, but it does work for most corporates globally. So I would suggest that keeping an eye on the ISSB work would be a good thing to do. Hopefully we get some more guidance from them at the end of this year. And then domestically, keeping an eye on what ASIC is putting out, and what the Australian Auditing Standards Board and the Australian Prudential Regulation Authority are also putting out. If you Google ESG and APRA, or ESG and ASSB, you'll see that there has been some guidance provided, but not a lot of sort of strong recommendations. So I think it's, yeah, everyone's sort of feeling it out at the moment. But I'd say ISSV is the one to watch. And yeah, happy to keep in touch about that. In the future, if I see anything, I can shoot you an email.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goreng Joshi.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for the great presentation. Very simple question. I guess in relation to looking at and developing this report, separate to that, did you guys look at, okay, who is actually doing better and what does good look like? Because I guess, sometimes the big brother does that and then slowly and steadily rest of the community starts following that as well. So maybe not as part of the developing this report, but I'm sure you would have done some analysis, who's actually doing better. And if you are to learn from them, who should we follow?
Oh, gee, that's a tough one, because we didn't. We tend not to try and name and shame or rank organisations, which is. But look, I think we do have an intrinsic knowledge from all the clients we work with. Who do we think has got robust ESG frameworks, and how are they delivering value for the organisation, and who needs more work, and who's evolving their maturity. So we certainly do have a view of that, but it is sensitive, because what's the actual benchmark that we're working with? Because there's so much uncertainty around what good looks like officially, it's hard to sort of rank organisations. But Eamon, you might have a view on some thoughts around, what are the key things that some of the organisations do that are probably the ones that others should aspire to?
Yeah, for sure. And look, I'll loop Sally in on this one as well. I mean, she did a lot of the heavy lifting on our case studies. We kind of tried to look more at who was excelling in individual areas and also who perhaps wasn't so much excelling in individual areas. I mean, you know, your super major oil and gas producers are definitely ahead of the curve in some respects, just by virtue of the fact that, you know, they have independent teams with huge volumes of resources and they're predicting what the future regulatory environment look like, you know, just preempting some of the questions in the chat there. You know, I mean, like your Shells and your BPs are doing relatively well when it comes to kind of the broad spectrum response. But I would say that realistically, it's much more of a kind of environmental focus in many respects. But that's just driven by the materiality of what they're doing. You know, for example, there's also I think it was BlackRock, was it, Sally, that had really good efficacy around, you know, social and gender diversity on their boards and those kind of things. So, is there one company that you should look at and copy? Probably not. I would say once again it comes down to that one size fits all. I mean, you know, there's things that Shell can't do by virtue of the size of the company that perhaps others could do, and there's also things that, you know, smaller companies can't do that large companies can do. So, you know, I think being proactive and learning from some of the research and some of the initiatives that they have is important, but I think it's not necessarily that you can copy one or the other. What you probably will start to see is end-to-end assurance and procurement is going to drive some of the change in the smaller organizations as large parties say, well, we're not going to work with you unless you do X, Y, and Z. But that's going to be kind of more prescriptive. I think the key message from this report is you should be proactive rather than reactive, because you don't want to lose a contract because you didn't have X number of % of whatever, you know, metric that they're measuring you by. You know, you kind of want to be ahead of that curve. So I hope that answered your question.
Look, I'm just aware that we've got 4 minutes. Brad, you there, Brad? Could you just put your camera on if you can? Brad's question, I think, has been answered. So, Brad, you're going to have to come back to me if it hasn't. It's around a view on maturing regulation on ESG and what that would look like. But I want to pick up on Jenny's question, which is looking at standardization and noting that this is a gas forum. Do you feel that ESG reporting requirements should be the same for all resource companies, gas versus oil versus coal versus hydrogen?
I think leaving feelings out of it, I think there's different considerations for each different kind of industry. You know, I mean, when you look at, for example, a mining company which has fundamentally different rehabilitation considerations to, say, an oil and gas company, you know, versus a power plant and a gas producer, I think they need to be different. But do I think the principles need to be the same? I think broadly speaking, as a team, we would probably agree that the principles of ESG don't necessarily change across the different ones. You still need to consider all of the different elements of ESG and all of your approach holistically about how you're actually having an impact. And then, you know, you might be able to easily, you know, tick off, well, we don't actually use any water in our operations, or we don't actually have any land access issues, or those kind of things. So I think broadly speaking, it's good to have a view of all of them. And I think everyone should be held to the same standard, which is positive impact on society and, you know, like having a sustainable business model. But it doesn't look the same when you get down to the granular detail. You can't have a coal spill in the Atlantic Ocean or whatever. Yeah. It's not as easy. Yeah.
Look, I'll be the first to say that the reason why we commissioned KPMG to do this report was because there was a massive gap in what was being, what initiatives were around, what definitions were around, what measuring and reporting looked like in the gas industry in terms of ESG. So that's how we actually got to here today. Folks, I just want to say a big thanks to everybody from KPMG, Eamon, Maddie, Matt, Sally. Look, you guys kicked that report out of the park. And thank you so much for also kicking it out of the park in terms of this presentation. I read the report time and time again, and I still learned stuff today. So thanks again. Thanks to everybody online. In terms of these reports, please look up our website. They are there. Otherwise, see me at the APGA conference. If anybody's going to that, I will have some paper copies. Otherwise, email me and I can bring them down in the plane tomorrow to Melbourne if anybody's going to the ENA dinner. That's it for me. Thank Thank you, everybody. Thank you for attending. I hope you have a great day.
Awesome.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Jen.
everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
If you have any
everybody.
questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. We're all pretty motivated by this topic, so always happy to spin a yarn. Awesome.
Thanks, Eamon.
Thanks, team.
Thanks
Bye.
all.
So.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Sally. Are you hanging in there, Matt?